Good afternoon, Maine. Chuck Ellis here, the host of the Muddy Waters podcast, which exists to help the people of Maine better understand what's going on in our state. Unfortunately, the way that our world works is everybody pushes people to pay attention to what's going on in Washington, D.C., rather than what's going on in your backyard. And so one of the things that we do here at the Muddy Waters podcast is try to talk about local issues, talk to local people, and get a sense on the ground of what's really going on in our state. And today, one of the ways we're doing that is we have with us House Rep out of Topsham, Rafael Macias. Macias. Sorry about that. Should have checked beforehand. Now I look like an idiot, but that's fine. Everybody makes mistakes. That's one of the beautiful differences between a live podcast and a canned one, where everybody's neatly cutting the things that might make it look bad. But I think in our world today, we really like raw and real much more than produced. Anyway, right?
Yeah, Machias is a city in Maine, so my name is like Machias, just without the H, Macias, but it's pronounced Macias. So.
Must see us. That's a great way to remember it. Must see us, but must see us. Yeah. Nice. Well, thank you so much for joining. Obviously, I say obviously. It was interesting. We put on the Cumberland County Republican Committee put on an event in Topsham that drew like a little bit of media and some people upset about the event. And one of the things that doesn't happen enough in our society, I think, is people that are on the right talking to people that are on the left. And we have our silos and we talk to ourselves. But one of the things that was really nice about that event is you, being a Democrat rep, came to the event, were there, and you came up to me and we had a conversation. And you're like, hey, I'd be interested in coming on the podcast. And obviously, for those who aren't following exactly, Representative Laurel Libby spoke at an event for Cumberland County and the Orion Center, and it was about girl sports and spaces and free speech. And again, afterwards, you approached me and we had a conversation, and that's what led to you coming here. So number one, what was really, I think, nice about it is like we don't agree on everything, but we were able to have a civil conversation. And one of the things that I'm constantly encouraging my people who are watching this podcast and listen to this podcast to do is engage in civil discourse, because I feel like the only way we move forward positively as a country is if we engage more, we talk more about what's going on. Because the reality is, though, both sides tend to think that they're right about everything, they're probably not. Like even as much as we're on our own side, there's probably things that we're missing because we're not having conversations with people who disagree with us. There are angles that we're not seeing, and I think that having civil discourse is really important, again, for us to be able to seek and find truth, and therefore make good decisions about how to govern our country. So anyway, so thank you first of all for having that conversation and for being willing to come on a conservative podcast. Yeah.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So before we get into I want to talk about some of the things that, from that event and some of your takeaways and whatnot, but I also want to give people an opportunity to understand who you are, where you come from, what got you involved in politics, why you're a Democrat, things like that. So just kind of, give your history, who you are, where you come from, and yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll start with how I got to Maine. Back in 2007, I had just gotten back from, 2006, I had just gotten back from Afghanistan, and then I was an aide for an admiral, and I was rewarded for both of those tours with a shipbuilder tour, a pre-com destroyer. DDG 106 USS Stockdale was being built in Bath Iron Works. And so I was one of the first officers detached to that ship, and our job was training, outfitting, and sailing away down the Kennebec. And we sailed away back in 2009. We bought our house in 2008 here and knew that we were going to retire here. I'm originally from San Diego, California, and my wife is from Adelaide, South Australia. And we both knew right away that Maine was just so beautiful and safe, a safe place to live, that we wanted to spend the rest of our lives here. So when I retired from the Navy, from where we were stationed in Japan at the time. In 2013, we moved back here, and I started a photography business as a portrait photographer, but also a landscape photographer. And from the day that I retired, I was getting up really early in the morning and chasing the sunrise and taking pictures all up and down the coast, lighthouses, just anything I could see. And we did that for several years. And I wasn't involved in politics. In fact, I was, voted more Republican and independent before I ever, voted for a Democrat. First time I ever voted for a Democrat was in 2020, by the way.
Oh, wow.
My first vote uh, for president was Ross Perot back in '92. Remember him in the 15%
Oh
flat.
yeah. Oh yeah.
I thought that was a good idea, but he was also a billionaire running for office. And then so in 2020, you know, uh, I before 2020, I had a lot of things going on. A lot of things changed in my life. I've been wrong on several occasions, and two of the major ones was my religious beliefs and also my political beliefs, and I think they're intertwined. Um, well, I stopped being a photographer back in 2018, I want to say. And I told my wife, I said, I don't want to do this anymore. And she's like, well, what do you want to do? And I said, nothing. I've been in the military for 22 years. I'd really like to just do nothing, have, no responsibilities, no due dates, just, and it was nice. It was good. And I spent a lot of time down by the river. We live on the Androscoggin River, and I learned to meditate. I learned to contemplate. And in those times of quietness, both my religion and my politics changed. It was something that happened in a flash, in an instant, and I knew how wrong I had been on some of many of my beliefs that were rooted in fear, really. So when I was sitting on the deck one day, I kind of got really frustrated because it was like I grew up in a military home, in a military community, and so everybody's fathers, parents had jobs. Everybody had food. Everybody had health care. And so when I joined the military, and here I am working with people that everybody's got a job, everyone has health care, everybody's taken care of. And so when I got out of the military and I moved back here, and Maine is a safe place to live. There wasn't a lot of crime, and still is comparatively not a lot of crime in Maine. I was sitting on the deck realizing how safe I was and how lucky I was to be able to do what I was doing, to have a pension and to do nothing if I wanted to do. And that's what I was doing. And so I got frustrated and I said, I've got to go fight. I've got to go, not fight, but fight for the rights of everybody to have a safe, comfortable, healthy place to live. And so I first started by writing an article for a magazine about an immigrant worker who was from Mexico. He was 16 years old. He hadn't seen his father in 8 years. He hadn't seen his father since he was 8, and he found him on a Vermont dairy farm. And so he saw him that evening, and his father said, I've got to go to sleep because I've got to get up really early and milk cows. And that same kid woke up the next morning and he was put onto a van and driven an hour and a half away from his father. He hadn't seen him in 8 years, and now he's gone, and he didn't see him for another 9 weeks after that. And his paycheck amounted to $3.50 an hour after all that time. He was the only one that spoke Spanish. There was only Portuguese and English speakers on the farm. And so he looked at his paycheck and realized how much he was working for how little. And that really upset me. And so I started looking into it and saw that the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 basically allows that. There's a agricultural worker exemption. They don't have to pay 16 to 20-year-olds minimum wage. And so they don't. And so I saw that was really just an exploitation of workers in general. And those workers, it's hard work. Their life expectancy is a whole lot less than the average life expectancy of your average American. And so there they are with substandard housing, afraid to go shop at the grocery store because they, particularly if they are undocumented. And by the way, there are employers hiring undocumented workers and paying them under the table and not paying taxes on it. So if we're talking about crimes, that's a crime right there, that not paying your taxes. So if their employers paying
Sure.
undocumented workers are not paying taxes. So I was really upset about that. And so I started lobbying with Maine People's Alliance, and I wanted to talk about this federal issue. But a lot of the legislators up in Augusta, they've got local issues, state issues. And so a lot of the federal issues, it is not the time or place to talk about it. So I'd ask questions, and they're like, that's not really, nothing we can do about the Fair Labor Standards Act. And but also at the same time, I was lobbying for a lot of other things: decriminalization of drugs, um, fair wages. Well, minimum wage had just passed before I started lobbying with them, but there was a lot of different progressive issues, and those issues were important to me because when you recognize the humanity of each individual person, no matter their status, no matter their race, no matter their age, they're people. And if you're going to work for an employer for 40 plus hours and you can't afford a house, heating oil, health care, your bills, is that really fair? Should employers expect their workers to give all their time and energy towards their profit when the workers themselves are struggling and they make just enough money to go back to work every day? That's not a way to live. So I, really wanted to fight for that. So when I did decide to run for office, and I'm jumping years,
Yeah.
between I started doing lobbying to when I actually became a legislator, I asked to be on the labor committee because I wanted to defend the rights of those workers and unions. I used to be an anti-union guy, thinking that they were making it difficult for employers to, really get by. And I understand that labor is one of the highest costs of doing business. But again, like I said, if you're going to work, if I'm going to hire somebody to work for me for 40 hours and they don't have a second job, I should be taking care of them. You take care of your workers, they take care of you. And so, and I know we can all agree on that, the fairness of it. So and but let me back up a little bit and talk about, you know, I talked about my realization, actually, of empathy for people who I don't know. Um, I I started feeling compassion and empathy for these people that were homeless, that they were falling asleep on the sidewalk, covered in snow or in the heat, and I really wanted to do something for them without having to take care of them all. You know, putting them all up in my house, but who has to foot the bill for taking care of people who are unable to take care of themselves? So there's a lot of issues that I wanted to help with, but realized that I'm not an expert in any of them. I don't know all the answers, but I was looking to ally with other folks that were trying to help people that had fallen on hard times.
Interesting. So that's a lot of really helpful stuff. Kind of understanding your trajectory, where you came from, and how yeah, I guess how you see the world. We'll say now, and I have tons of thoughts. I think there's a lot of stuff to go with here. So but I'm curious before we kind of jump into things where we're probably going to disagree, which is fine. I think we can have a conversation as adults and get good places and learn some from each other. But you talked about like your philosophy or your religious viewpoints changed. What to what? Just out of curiosity, I'm just kind of.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. So I was raised Catholic when I was growing up in the 70s. And I was an altar boy, went to catechism, did all that, was baptized when I was an infant. Then my parents separated and we moved down to Texas, South Texas. And that's where we started going to my grandparents' church, which was the Southern Baptist Church. hellfire and brimstone, your Lord and Savior, or hell, you choose type stuff. And it, really puts the fear of God into people. And so I, at the age of 17, I left home and basically um, knew that I didn't believe in that God that I had been taught as a child. And so I just believed in no God. It was much easier. I didn't feel any guilt. I didn't feel any shame. I didn't feel any fear of hell, particularly if you don't believe in God. And so I did that for 30 years. I married a woman who had never been to church in her life, except for 2 times, a wedding and a funeral. And I also raised my kids to be atheists. Well, uh, now fast forward to, I want to say it was maybe 2016, sitting in the living room watching television with my wife, and she'd seen me cry maybe once or twice, my father's funeral and another event I don't remember, and I just started busting out crying, like ugly crying. And she's like, "What's wrong?" And I said, "I've got to give everything away." And she's like, "What do you mean?" I says, "There's a God." And for me to talk to my wife about there's a God, she knew, all my reasons for not believing in God up to that point. And now here I was completely changing my belief in something as big as that in an instant. And from that point, for the next 3 days, I was like hyper present. I was like in the moment, and I was like life was just beautiful, blue skies, blossoming flowers, everything was nice. And then I lost it. I dropped back under again, and my, you could go back into your head. You're constantly focusing on the future or focusing on the past, never in the present moment. And I basically started meditating more to seek that feeling that I felt when there was a realization of God, and it was more of a remembrance of God. Like if you've run into somebody on the street and you forgot their name, and then the next day you remember their name, and you're like, ah, shit. It's that kind of feeling. For that whole time, and that grief that I was feeling was, oh my God, I was wrong for that long, and everything that I did and said, now I have to admit that I was wrong. And but in doing that, um, I started seeking that feeling more and more, and I started going down to the river and meditating more and more, and coming with a lot more aha moments, realizations, enlightenments. God is love, God is light, there's nothing to worry about, all those feelings that you get in meditation when you are, in the moment, in the present moment. um, that's that still small voice that you hear, and ideas, and I don't know. It's really hard to explain when you get to that moment. Those times where you've seen the light, type
Yeah.
thing. I've experienced that, and so when I come out of those meditations and try to explain it to my wife excitedly, she's like, I don't know what you're talking about, or yeah, I already knew that. Duh. So.
Yeah, I would say that I've experienced some similar things. Like my faith is, I don't know exactly what that God is for you. If I'm assuming you'll share, but for me, I'm a Christian. It's the God of the Bible. But I've had those moments where, like, for me, it was there were some things that happened as I really worked hard to do some things in college, and was very frustrated, and then got to this point where I realized I was really angry. And then I was like, well, if I'm angry, like, who's ultimately in control of all things is from my viewpoint. And well, that's God. So if I'm angry about circumstances, then I'm really angry at God. And so I sat down and like just let it all out to God. You call that meditating, or however you want to put it, prayer. And then, as you kind of talked about, like the idea of like this still small voice, or this, for me, I kind of feel like it's somehow God is like shaping ideas in my mind, and I'm like, he kind of revealed some things to me that I'd been missing about what was going on. And I was like, oh my gosh, I went from being angry to grateful and thankful. And like, I explained that, as you said, you explain that to people who haven't had an experience like that, and they're just like, what are you talking about, dude?
Yeah.
But that's really, yeah, really interesting. But so in maybe you want to get into a little bit of like, what is that part of like the Christian religion idea of God, or is this something something
Well,
else?
um, I would say there's a lot of the aspects of Christianity. I believe that there was a man named Jesus. I believe that he was trying to teach everyone in a Jewish nation at the time. He was a Jewish person, and all his disciples were Jewish people, and he was trying to tell them a different way from the Old Testament, or their books of wisdom and knowledge back then. And he was basically, saying that the way to achieve peace and serenity in life is to help others. And so I've experienced that peace and serenity wash over me, and that feeling of not having to fear anything. Particularly living in Maine, we don't have any poisonous snakes, no poisonous spiders. There's nothing to be afraid of. I've lived in 13 different states, and Maine is just a safe place to live. So that feeling of safety and peace and serenity, I just wanted to share that with everybody. And so, keeping it in my life, I had to, try hard to introduce it to other people, or just remind people that there are safe places to live, and Maine is one of them, and I want to keep that.
Interesting. Well, so I thank you for sharing. I'm just kind of fascinating by your trajectory. So one of the things that I want to kind of get at before we, I think, engage more in kind of like the differences and kind of overarching, I think, viewpoint or difference in worldview about how you approach this. Because I think the reality is, like, contrary to popular belief, maybe we'll say, conservatives do also want people to be happier and to be better off financially, to be, more free, and to, and to kind of have all that serenity. So, like, ultimately, a lot of times, like, the question isn't, do you want that for people? It's, but, like, how do you want to get there? And there are different philosophies on how to get there. But I'm curious, because, like you said, up until like 2020, you you were voting more Republican. So what was it up until that point that had you on the conservative side? Why were you voting for Republican ideology? And because I think I know the answer, but I'd rather hear it. I have some, based on like what you've kind of said happened and kind of shifted your viewpoint. I have some theories, but I want to let you answer. It's your story, not
I'll be
mine.
straight up. It was taxes. I
Okay.
used to see lower taxes, but also a higher cost of living increase. It was the dollars. I was in the military. I had a steady paycheck. I always had a paycheck. Wasn't going to be fired. I was, you do your job, you show up on time, you do your job, you do well. And I was doing well. And, whenever a Democrat was in office, the budget for the military would shrink, and, you saw it affect you in that way. So when and frankly, I was, pro capitalism. The idea that if you, work hard, and, hustle, you can prosper, you can do well. And our laws, make it safe to take risk. Makes it safe to be a business person, and also offers incentives to go into business. So the American dream is to, work hard, have a lot of money, have a white picket fence, a big house, and several cars, and comfortable, doing what you want when you want. But unfortunately, people have, while chasing that dream, they put themselves into debt, trying to keep up with the Joneses, and look the part, act as if, and they find themselves in debt and really stuck to employment. They can't take a day off. They have to get to work, and there's way too many people out there struggling to get by, and they're working hard, and they see it in their taxes, they see it in inflation, they see it in the cost of fuel, and their dollar doesn't go as far, and so I see how, corporations can benefit by large corporations and the politicians that they help fund on either side of the aisle. I'm not a diehard Democrat. I am a someone who just believes in fairness, and wants everybody in America to have a comfortable lifestyle. And if they want to work, they can. If they don't, they won't. And that sounds like heresy for a lot of people out there.
Well, I
But
think in particular, the interesting part is if they don't want to work, that they don't have to. And it's like, geez, that's where you're going to get a lot of resistance here. It's like, if you choose not to work, I don't think other people should take care of you.
no, okay, yeah, you're right. You're
Yeah.
right. But if you are a corporation and you are a multi-billion-dollar corporation and you use the resources of the land, of the energy, of the human resources, labor, and you're not contributing back to the infrastructure to upgrade, to improve, to help the labor, particularly the highest cost, then what are you doing? What is the purpose? Is it just to get on the Forbes 500 and climb your way to the top and see and hoard wealth, or to this whole trickle down idea? It never played out. People were getting jobs, and then they used to think that they could work for 30 years, get a gold watch, and retire in comfort. Now your average person works 10, 12 jobs in a lifetime or more, and with nothing to show for it, and no gold watch, and just a sayonara, you're on your own. And they're waiting, and they wait to retire till after 65. I know people who are working into their 70s, because they need to, because they didn't save enough.
Yeah,
And
so I worked in banking for a lot of years, so I'm very I deal a lot of these a lot of people who saved or didn't save, and or I think there's a combination of things that are happening. I don't want to dive too deep into that. But one of the things that I will say is I disagree with some people on the right, in the sense that I think when it comes to major corporations, this is probably an area where you and I are going to be able to agree. Where now, again, what the actual solution is, I think you and I are going to disagree about. But at the very least, I am in favor. So when I think about the differences between socialism, or a socialistic ideology, and capitalism, the main issue that I have with socialism is not that it doesn't sound nice; it's that I don't think it works in reality. Historically, every socialistic country has turned into a communistic country where people's rights are taken away and the oligarchs have all the power and have everything, and everybody else. It's kind of like, the way that I describe it is like, in capitalism, some people, it's going to be easier for some people to get ahead than others, but ultimately there's potential opportunity for anyone, right? That's the idea. You may disagree with that, but I think it's easier for sure if people already have money, but it's also possible for people without money to find a way, which is what happened in my life. Like, my family, we were poor, we were on food stamps growing up, and I was able to do something and make something of myself. That opportunity exists.
yeah,
And this is why people come here from all around the world. This is a big part of it. Whereas in socialism, you have shared poverty, right? So in capitalism, is it unfair in the sense that some are able to get ahead easier than others? I mean, you can say that for sure. The problem is, like, with socialism, my main problem with socialism, and you're not necessarily saying socialism, but the arguments are more in that direction. But the problem. So for one of the problems with a capitalistic society, is definitely that greed rules. Greed runs things, right? Right. And greed is a sin, right? That's bad, right? At the same time, that's actually why the system works, because people are going to work hard so that they can get something for themselves. Whereas socialism is built on a hope and an idea that people will work hard for other people just as hard as they'd work for themselves. And reality doesn't tend to work that way. And this is why I believe socialism has always ultimately fallen into communistic ideology, and again, the shared poverty, economically, things depress and stuff like that. So that's again. But when it comes to like major corporations, and then I'll let you respond. When it comes to major corporations, I do have a problem with the way in which our current society is structured, because what happened. So we'll use a policy that was passed. I believe it was not this last session, but I think the one prior to that, and it was the policy on family medical leave family medical leave, the 1% tax that a lot of people on the other side of the aisle from you are upset about. And I think for good reason. And when I look at a policy like that, right? For instance, what happens when you bring in a policy like that, which sounds great, right? In my opinion, like I would love for everybody who had a medical real serious thing to be able to have the ability to take time off and still receive income. I think that I love it in principle. Like I'd love to be able to have a society where that's something that made sense and we could do. The problem is like it doesn't work for small businesses, and not because small businesses don't care about their employers, but one, and I know that they don't actually carry the majority of the cost. If they're below a certain dollar amount, number of people, they are only they can either choose to pay 0.5% or their employee can pay 0.5%. Either way, they don't cover the cost, but the cost isn't the cost for them. The cost is if you have like 5 employees, for instance, or 10 employees, like you can't really afford to be down that person, and the law requires them to maintain that person's employment. And so if they hire somebody else, you're put in a position where you either hire somebody and you tell them you're only a temporary worker. And when you hire temporary workers, you get temporary quality, right? Or they lie to somebody and tell them that they're going to stick around for the long term. And then when the other person comes back, they fire them, right? So it creates, for a lot of your smaller employers, it creates this problem that they can't really address. And this is just on top of all the other things. A lot of the things that we have in our society that are good, your major employers are already offering. Like my company that I used to work for had a program like this. They didn't need the government to tell them to do it. They did it on their own. Why? Because they wanted to attract employees. But they're also a large employer. And because they're a large employer, they have a larger pool. They have the infrastructure that they can put together to make it possible for them to be able to handle people being out like this. They have with more employees, with more financial money. It was a bank that I worked for anyway. They have the capacity to handle that. But your smaller employers don't have the infrastructure to handle that. So one of the problems, these types of regulations, what they actually end up doing is making it easier for major corporations to scoop up more of the market, because your smaller employers struggle and decide to give up and quit. And so anyway, that's just like one example, but I'll let you respond. But that's a big part of my problem. I don't disagree that there are these greedy major corporations, and I don't love how they operate. But I think the answer is a more free economy will allow your smaller companies to be able to compete with the big guys.
Yeah. So those small businesses, I believe the number is 15 who don't have to provide.
There actually isn't. They removed that. There is no minimum number of employees with that.
No,
they had it initially in the policy, but they removed it.
I'm not sure about that.
We'll fact check it later, but okay. I remember I was paying really close attention to this because economics, again, I worked in banking for 15 years. I was a math major. Economics is my thing. And I had a lot of business clients. And so I was paying very close attention to this. And I know that initially it was in, but I'm pretty sure they struck it out. I'll while you respond,
we'll verify that.
Dig.
But I understand for small employers that, training employees is one of the highest costs, and then you train them and they decide to not come back. That's a lot of wasted resources. So I know that number, I think it's 10 or 15 where small businesses don't have to. But one of the things I do remember before I ever got into politics was, talking about how attracting employers to our state that provide good jobs. And so these national companies or international companies, they come here and they offer good jobs, but for management, and everybody else falls under 32 hours. So they are part-time workers. So they don't qualify for health care. So imagine, as a government saying, government, we're not going to provide health care only to the disabled or to the elderly or to children, but everybody else, you got to go work. You have to find an employer that provides health care. And so the employer provides health care to the corporate office and to management, but everybody else, talking about retail, talking about food service workers, or what are those franchises that they can opt whether or not to pay for health care. So there's a lot of people who are being told, they work for a good employer, but they're not being provided hours, and they're not being provided health care. So if you don't get it from the government and you don't get it from your employer, how do you get health care without paying out of pocket and going into debt? It's happening. My wife was a manager at Joanne Fabric. She was one of two people, and when she started working, there were like 24 people. When she finally became manager, I think she had like maybe 15 people, and only two of them were covered with health care or with any kind of benefits. Everybody else was, I think they could earn some paid time off, but everybody else was they were fighting for hours, and they had no health care. And I thought that was just completely unfair. These big corporations who just are not taking care of their employees. And why would you go back? So the paid family medical leave, it was a way to help workers, period. A way to help workers, and there's a lot of people who are taking time from their jobs in order to care for a loved one who is elderly, who is sick, who has cancer, who is dealing with their own issues. And so finding a way to make that happen without losing pay. We're trying to pay caregivers. We've got the oldest population in the nation here in Maine, and there's a lot of elderly folks sitting alone in their home needing care, but there's nobody to help them because there's nobody who's willing to work for minimum wage to do, frankly, a job that's really tough. And
Well,
so
what's interesting, you are right. By the way, I did find it out. I thought they had struck it out. I'm glad that they left it in, because it's even for 15 employees or less. It's a huge. But even for down to 15 employees is, to me, like with a lot of those businesses, I think the problem that I have with this is that like a lot of your smaller businesses under, like, not these major corporations with thousands and tens of thousands of employees, but businesses with even like 50 employees, 200 employees, like the opening the door to something like this is something that is very challenging for those employees. So those businesses to be able to handle the loss of the people on their team. So I still stand by what I said in general. I think it is one of those things that makes it easier for major corporations to scoop up more market share. So if you don't like major corporations, you shouldn't like policies that are like, the end result is less smaller businesses and more bigger businesses is kind of what I'll say. I understand the idea behind it. I care. I have compassion. But like, I think my question is like, because like kind of some of the way that you've kind of talked about work in general, and somebody's relationship to their employer is almost like indentured servitude, in the sense that like the employer is essentially the slave owner of the employee. And I think that like, it's almost like the language that you're using is that's how it should be. And so since they own you, and I know you're not using that language, but this is what I'm saying is like, it's like, if I choose to go and work for this employer, that means that employer needs to take care of me in every way. And it's like, I don't agree with that in general. I don't think that should be a requirement. I actually, I'm okay with not receiving like healthcare benefits and stuff like that. I think our healthcare system is screwed up. I'm not saying that employers shouldn't be able to, but I think whether or not again, I'll talk about these things and say that for the most part, many employers, the reason that like healthcare is part of what's offered to employees for the most part here in America is because employers were trying to attract employees. And so they added it, retirement benefits, pensions, and stuff like that. Those were not government mandated. right? Those were companies saying, in order to be able to attract talent, in order to be able to maintain employees and keep people with us, we need to offer something to them. And so your bigger companies who had the ability to do that did that. The smaller companies don't, because they largely can't afford to do so. And so making requirements for them to do things like that makes it more challenging for them to be able to compete against the big guys.
Yeah, I remember researching Dunkin' Donuts, and they had like, I want to say 1,500 employees in Boston. Meanwhile, every other employee doesn't get health care. So when Dunkin' Donuts says they provide health care to their employees, they're talking about they're the ones that work in their building, not in every other building across our nation. Those employees are working long hours before everybody wakes up, and they're working for, shit wages. And so seeing those big corporations abuse their workers like that, that's not cool. And so, how do we combat that without, affecting those mid to, large companies that are and do want to attract good employees by offering benefits, paid time off, paid family medical leave, healthcare benefits. I mean, healthcare benefits. My son-in-law, he was paying, I want to say, $1,100 a month for healthcare.
Yeah. So here's a question. So I think like you focused a lot on like these jobs that are paying like minimum wage, and I think that there are a variety of issues. I think we are in a situation right here in our country where we don't have enough people. I think we have enough people who are working age who could work, but I don't think we have enough people who are working age who want to work. I think there's some data that shows that there are somewhere around 10 to 15 million young men in particular in our country. I think it's 15 million or so that are either, according to, whether their tax records will say, are not working and living either with mom or their girlfriend, right? And maybe some of them are doing jobs on the side and getting paid under the table. Who knows? But that's a lot of people that are not in the workforce. And how are they surviving? Well, one way or another, they're living off of the rest of us, and that's not good. Whether it's like people are supporting them, or maybe they're somehow found a way to get on government benefits. I know, like working in the banking system, I had a number of clients who talked about how they worked the system. What's fascinating is how open they were to talk about this while I'm opening up their account, sitting there knowing that I'm working a job and people like me are paying them to be able to live, and they're bragging about the fact how they got on the system. But there are some people who do that. I don't know what percentage of the population of the people that are on the system are fall into that category, but there are definitely some that I worked with, but so I think there's a combination of things. One, there are people out there that should be working, and I think that's something that we need to figure out how to address as a society. But the second thing that I would say is like jobs like Dunkin' Donuts and Starbucks and McDonald's. These for the most part, these should not be looked at as being career jobs. As Truth Slinger, who's making about 1,000 comments, I will give him credit for saying that one. I think it's a good point, but it's also like these are jobs that historically, I remember talking to a really good friend of mine who, like, he worked at Dunkin' Donuts when he was in high school, and it was a really great opportunity. Dunkin' Donuts was actually McDonald's. It was a really great opportunity for him to learn hard work and to learn what it means to make some money. And he, it was a great to prepare him for life. And that at the time, almost everybody who was working in the fast food industry were teenagers. Now we have a society where teenagers don't work. And like I think we've created this, and personally, it seemed not exclusively. There are some out there that work, don't get me wrong, but for the most part, a lot of your teenagers aren't working. And these jobs are being filled by other people, largely right now, not by people seeking careers, but actually we're like a lot of the, especially in the Portland area, a lot of, companies, there are some hotels that bring people in to work at the hotel from like Jamaica and El Salvador. And then those people pick up second and third jobs working at McDonald's and Dunkin' Donuts and all these kinds of places, because local people aren't taking those jobs. But I think that those jobs, I don't think we should try to structure a society where we see Dunkin' Donuts as a career job. I think that's
Right.
bad for society. And so I don't think they need, I don't care. I'm not that I don't care how much they pay, but I don't care as much how they pay, if that makes sense. Like, I don't think, like, I think we should focus on how do we make it so that people don't want to work that job. And there are other job opportunities elsewhere. That's what we should be doing. Not trying to make sure that if you do decide that you want to work at Dunkin' Donuts, that you make at least this much money. I think that these types of like government manufactured like minimum wages and things like that don't have the desired impact. I think the idea, what I feel about a lot of Democrat policy that is focused on empathy and stuff like that, is that they're good ideas in theory, but practically they don't have they don't lead to the results that you want. They don't lead to a more free and financially healthy society. Instead, they seem to lead to more typically as the minimum wages rise, the cost of living rises faster. Not this, my brain is not working. Inflation, that's what I'm saying. When you raise minimum wage, inflation raises at a higher level than the minimum wage. So over against your cost of living, minimum wages tend to result in lower effective wages, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've all seen the minimum wage rising from $7.25, I think, in 1996, and now it's in Maine, it's $14.65, and still we're looking to bring it up higher. When I retired from the Navy as a lieutenant commander, my pension was about $45,000 a year. Imagine that, making $45,000 a year without doing anything. And I wanted to see if we could afford a house, our mortgage, our car payments, our insurance. Insurance costs are so expensive. And our energy costs, whether it's heating oil and electricity, our cell phones, our subscriptions to Netflix and Spotify, and all those things. Could we? And the short answer is no, we couldn't, even at that, with 45,000. And that's about $24 an hour if I was working full time. But paring down, living modestly, we could not have the latest phones, not pay our cars off and keep them longer, have a place that's not by the river, all those things that we could have done. And so when I did tell my wife that I don't want to be a photographer anymore, and she says, "What do you want to do?" I said, "Nothing." I did nothing, and I lost a truck. I sold my motorcycle. I got rid of toys, collectibles. We started paring down in order to live. And so when both of us are working with my base retirement income, we were comfortable. We weren't stressed, but we also had health care. I have the VA and we have TRICARE. Can you imagine how little stress you feel if you know that you're covered? That if you don't get the wrong diagnosis, you're going to go bankrupt. Imagine how little stress you have if knowing that you're covered. Unfortunately, stress is a killer, and it causes a lot of the illnesses that we have. Stress is a killer, and we know that. And then the insurance comes in and picks the bones off of our system, our Medicare system. They siphon all the wealth out of the system, and it's not the doctors being paid, it's not the patients being helped, it's the insurance companies that are just siphoning off all the wealth. And so we throw money at problems, and there are people that profit, and everybody else gets to suffer. And we all see that.
Well, I think arguments could be made that so there are a couple of things that I would say. Is like, number one, I think one of the big differences between Democrat ideology and Republican ideology, well, some Republican idea. What's interesting, I'll just say, is like some people are like, we need more parties, and I'm just sitting here like, there's so much variability within the Republican Party, even within the Libertarian. It's funny, you ask a Libertarian, most Libertarians will say they're the only true, real Libertarian, because all Libertarian, like, there's so much diversity within the Libertarian movement. There are some consistent things. Same thing within the Democrat Party. There's a variety of viewpoints. I don't think we necessarily need more parties. I think people just need to pay better attention to where people stand, and then so when it comes to, like, I don't think the government is the answer. I think this is the segment of the Republican Party. I'm less of a Republican than I am a conservative, and but when it comes to like how to make a better society, I think less government is the answer. This is actually what America was founded on, right? I think the more the government gets involved, the more problems they create. And then they create another program to be able to fix the problem that they created that creates another a problem that they need to create a program to fix. And it's this like whack-a-mole problem. And they need to like probably ask more questions and pull back on some things before they start implementing more things. But I don't think that I think a big part of the problem in the rise in the cost of healthcare was the Affordable Care Act. In fact, one of the things that like the idea of making sure that everybody has insurance and that those who can't get it are going to be covered in one form or fashion by the government. I mean, one of the biggest problems with like Medicaid is Medicare or Medicaid, whichever one the state funded one. I think it's Medicare, right? Main care is what I'm trying to say. Main care, which it doesn't matter. I think that's
Medicaid is for 65 and older, and Medicare is main.
Okay,
Medicaid is main care, and
right.
Medicare are for seniors.
So the problem with some of these programs is that they don't pay. They pay like 30% of the cost. And so like in order to subsidize the cost of all the people that are on these things that are already taking up a lot of government dollars, they're having to charge people extra. When you look at, I can't remember the report that I was, or I think this was a conversation more, but it was citing actual data that basically suggests that because of Obamacare, right? Employers more and more were having to push off some of the cost of insurance on their employees, whereas previously they were covering the cost wholly. On top of that, raises that they would have been giving their employees, they were having to spend instead on the increasing cost of healthcare. And again, it's one of these things where like it sounds great to say that everybody should be able to have access to, but somebody's got to pay for it. There's in order to do things, you have to have money that comes from somewhere. And I agree that there are a lot of problems in the healthcare system. I think one of them is that the pharmaceutical industry has far too big of a lobby. And I think they're doing a lot of their lobbying is actually giving money to the universities to convince them that everybody needs to be on medication in some form or fashion. That the answer is always some form of medication, whether it's temporary or permanent. And so they're influencing things and they're getting paid a lot of money. But I don't blame the doctors primarily so much for our problems in healthcare. And again, I think some of the money is going to doctors. Doctors do make a lot of money, but we also don't have enough of them. With part of the reason is we have a shortage there. But again, like I think like when we talk about like there are these problems in our society and the question is how do we answer them? I think where you and I are going to disagree is I don't think the government is the answer. I think charity, I think the governments in general are the most mismanaged businesses in existence. They're incredibly inefficient. People don't move quickly. I mean, they're notorious for this, right? Everybody's like, oh, it's government, right? Because if you got a government contract, it's guaranteed, and you're not going to work any faster than you have to. Like all the jokes about people paving roads and how you drive by and there's like 18 people there and there's like 2 or 3 people working, and obviously it's always more complicated than that. But like the reality is, like a lot of these people who are working in government jobs and doing these things, they're not. Because they don't have to be. One of the nonprofits also fall into this category largely, especially if they're funded by the government, where they're not as motivated to work hard to get money because that's not what their purpose is, right? And so there's not a lot of motivation, and a lot of the problems between our ideologies, I think, is one. Fails to address the issue of motivation. Like, what is it that actually motivates people to go out and work hard to make our society better? And my concern, my primary issue is not the ends that the Democrats say that they're trying to get to, although in some of the other categories, it definitely is the ends that they're trying to get to. But in some categories, it's not like I want people to, again, be healthy, be whole, have access to what they need. It's how do we get there? And I think because I see the government as being the most inefficient monster that ever existed, I'm like, give it less control over stuff. Let's figure it out on a free market side. And I think if the government wasn't doing stuff, there would be a lot more people who would have more money in their pockets, and they would be able to be more generous with people who are in need. But also, I think these programs, and I'll give you an example, these programs hinder people from being able to advance their lives. So 2 examples from people I know. One who, single mom, was working for me when I was at the bank, and she was a 30-hour employee. But she was a single mom. And so I was like, okay, well, I want to help her out as much as possible. And so I'll give her as many hours as I can on top of that. We'll find ways, go cover at another branch, whatever it might be. If somebody's out, you get to work an additional day. And so she was working close to 40 hours for quite a while. And then she came in and she's like, I can't, you have to cut me down to exactly 30 hours, no more. Otherwise, I lose like whatever it was, $500 or whatever a month worth of benefits for like the additional $200 that she was going to make. And so she was stuck. She couldn't because she couldn't afford to go from here where she's, because of the government benefits that exist, she's living at this level, to go from here, which is like, we'll say maybe $20,000 to $25,000 at the time. This is like 10 years ago, to the place where to making $45,000, right? In order to go from here to here, like in terms of like how you're living in this world, there's no difference. They're exactly the same, but there's this
cliff, they call it
cliff in between that you have to somehow make it through. And she didn't. So she backed off. I think I have some theories that she started a business and she did some other stuff. That was a path to maybe be able to do that. Because especially in the early days of starting a business, there are ways to live at a higher level than people who are W-2'd while making less money on paper, if that makes sense, with the tax code. And so there's a little bit more flexibility there. There's a bit more of a path there, but there are other challenges that we won't get into. So she just was like, I'm not going off over the cliff. And I was talking to another friend of mine who was in a similar situation, originally from Russia. He started making more money and all of a sudden lost all these benefits. And he's got 2 kids at home and he's got a wife, and he's just like, why am I doing this? Right. So like the temptation was, I should just not don't pay me that much because I don't want to lose those benefits. But instead he worked hard. He got a job working at an employer that pays really well, essentially doing the job of an engineer at this point. And now he's doing really well. But like a lot of people are not going to make that decision. The first person is much more likely to happen than the second person.
Mm-hmm.
So I just threw a lot at you. So I guess
you're right. I mean, people have to make a tough decision. Do I want to make do I want to make more but risk losing a free benefit that is costly, particularly healthcare benefits? Having to make that tough decision is not fair to anybody who's working hard. It really shouldn't. So that's why when I talk about these socialist ideals, I grew up in the same country, and we heard about the USSR and how they have little innovation. Everybody can have the same type of thing, and they can have any color they want as long as it's gray. And there's not a lot of choice there. And so I get the idea of capitalism and innovation and prosperity and advancement. But when people are deciding to make less so they qualify for something as expensive as insurance, something you hope you never have to use, but would you rather get it for free or pay $1,100?
Well, the problem is it's not free regardless.
Well, I
right? Somebody's paying it, and when the government's paying it, it's worse for everyone. Like people on main care are not getting, even though they have access, right? They're not getting the same quality of care. A lot of the places don't accept main care because it's just too much of a hassle to deal with, and the government slow pays and doesn't pay enough. And there are tons of problems with it, and it's not actually doing what it's supposed to be doing. And in some ways, a lot of it's clogging up the emergency rooms in particular for whatever reason, but that's a whole nother story.
And they're paying higher costs in the emergency room for overnight stays than they would if there were just enough beds for everybody and there were enough people to take care of all the people that were sick. I get it. But
I'm
There,
not trying to railroad you and just like attack you with stuff, but these are the
uh,
challenges. Like I hear where you're coming from. Like I had this conversation with my brother back in the Obama days, and he was very big into Obama until Obama got elected and didn't do what Obama said he was going to do, and then he became very anti-Obama. But he was talking about like Medicare for like healthcare for all, government funded, and he eventually shifted his views, and now he's a libertarian. But I think like the he like there's this idea, and I think it's pervasive, I would say, on the Democrat side, of this like world with unicorns and rainbows where we can afford that. And I think the problem is like there's one system, to my knowledge, where there's a country that has universal health care, and it works relatively well. And that country is Norway, is my understanding. Again, I'm not an expert in this. I'm not pretending to be, but feel free to do your own research. How does Norway get away with it? Well, Norway gets away with it because they sell oil. Like the country owns oil. This is my understanding. Again, feel free to fact check me if I'm wrong, but I heard this from a very reliable source, and I've looked into it a little bit. But this is how they're able to do it, right? And so like that's unique. We don't have that situation here, and most other countries. Like, when you hear about some of the healthcare, there are pros, and people will cite those pros. I think it's funny that people moved here from Europe, Eastern European countries, and they live in America, and then they are like, I wish it was like it is in Eastern Europe. And it's like, in terms of that, when somebody has a baby, they can take 2 years off, and still get paid by the government, I think, and some other things like that. And I'm like, well, then why aren't you there? If it's so great there, why are you here? And I'm not, these are people that I like. I'm not telling them I want them to leave, but it's like, well, there's a reason that you're here and you're not there. And then you hear stories from other people that are like, they're here in America and they've got some medical debt, but they're like, here in America, we've got, medical care is very expensive, but at least we can get it done. Whereas when they were back in the UK, where they're from, like, it would be government funded, but like, it would, like, you have to get in this really long line and you have to wait, and it takes time, and there are huge problems with that. And so like, I think we have to live in the real world, and I think that there are huge problems with our current healthcare system. But I don't think the answer is more government. I think that's the overall point that I would come at, is because I think they've done a piss poor job with just about everything that they've managed ever. I don't think I don't think it's a good idea to give them more.
Yeah, I'm not a libertarian, but I do, believe that, our government was founded with the Constitution to protect our borders, protect, commerce, and protect us during times of war, but also protect our rights that are given to us by the Constitution. And I'd really like to start talking about some of those issues that
Sure.
Representative Libby brought up, particularly about freedom of speech and the First Amendment rights to
Absolutely.
Congress, to assemble. And she did say a good thing by saying, that the people that were protesting outside did have a right to be there. And I was not part of, organizing any of the protests. I didn't have my name anywhere in there. In fact, I wanted to go to this event so I could hear her speak, to see what she had to say. And her issue about her First Amendment rights being squelched by a tyrannical Democrat government. I think she used tyranny, and particularly she brought up the Speaker of the House, Ryan Fecto, and his censure of her, and that's why she sued and went to the Supreme Court and got her rights back to vote and all that good stuff. But she went from talking on the floor about her freedom of speech to Fox News, and on a national level, speaking about her issues and her problems with men and women's sports, and that's not a freedom of speech issue. Nobody was arresting her. The government was not arresting her. The government wasn't turning off her mic. The government wasn't doing that. In fact, what she did was she doxed a young man, a teen who wants to play sports. And I'll go to I heard that he placed 9th when he was competing as a boy, and placed first competing in a track and field sport where it's really individual times, individual um, heights for, I think he was a pole vaulter. It's an individual sport. So if you're worried about who you're competing, uh, particularly if they are, have they're stronger and they can jump higher, I think that makes everybody in the field better. per, you know, Jumping higher, running faster. Now, we can have the argument about, women can't compete at a level of men. I was just looking to see, the 4 minute mile, and there are no women that have run the 4 minute mile, but 4 minute and 6 seconds, they can compete. They can run faster than me. They can run faster than you, and probably most men that I know who can't run the 4 minute mile. There are women that are doing that. So, you can compare men and female and say men are stronger, can jump higher, run faster, longer, all that good stuff, and that women shouldn't play in men's sports. That was the whole reason behind Title IX back in the early 70s, of saying
Well, let's be clear about a couple of things. So nobody on our side, anyway, is saying that we have any problem with women trying to compete in men's sports. That's not, nobody's saying that at all. And the reason for Title IX wasn't that people didn't want to allow women to compete in male sports, but that they couldn't. They weren't making teams. They weren't having access because they weren't good enough, generally speaking. And as you've said, sometimes you get these women you do have women that are very athletic and more athletic than me. But by and large, if you take men versus women, men are stronger, faster, etc. And this is why it makes these big stories when a biological male is competing and clearly wins by a wide margin and breaks records like what happened nationally. I just want to make those points clear, but go ahead, continue.
Yeah. And so what she did was, she thought it was unfair, and that women's accomplishments, girls' accomplishments, were being erased because in the record books, because they were competing against an unfair advantage of a boy, a teen boy that was jumping higher. Well, what she did was, she posted a picture of him when he was competing with boys, and then a picture of her when she was competing with girls. And I'm using the pronouns out of respect for this person. It takes a lot of guts for someone to say, I'm not going to accept a male privilege. And I'm using that term, male privilege. Some of your audience may have an issue with that, but we do have a privilege. We do have a privilege of being able to walk through a parking garage without carrying a pair of keys in our fist.
Going back to the fact that men are stronger and
yeah,
we're less fearful, we're less vulnerable. I don't know if I don't like the language, and I think my people probably won't either, of saying privilege, but like the point of men don't have some of the challenges that women have. I think that's absolutely true.
Yeah.
I think the place where me in particular, part of why me and us on the right don't love that language is it's almost like it suggests that we should feel bad for that fact. And I think that's where
yeah.
I draw the line. But I do want to talk about, like, because I want to let you finish, but I also want to, you've used the word doxing a number of times, and I've heard this a lot regarding Laurel Libby, and I think that this is one of the challenges that I sometimes have with the Democrat Party and people on the Democrat side, is that you take a word that means one thing and then use it for something else. And so doxing, my understanding historically, right, is that is either sharing something that's not already publicly available, or sharing somebody's personal home address or something along those lines. And in this situation, that's not what happened, right? Like, there were photos that were available on the internet. That's where they were obtained. So this was already in the public. And what she did is she explained with some words, and then took two pictures that already exist to show it was like the example, Exhibit A.
Yeah. And I think about that a lot, and what that action actually did. She dead named this person. I've got a daughter who changed their name from Nikki to Peyton, and it was something that I dealt with in my own home, and we respected that, and we've changed what we call our own daughter when we named her when she was, a day old. They decided to change their name, and we respected that. What Laurel Libby did was, dead name this guy to embarrass him for whatever reason, her, them,
So, so I
and
think
so
that's
doing that, it really robs people of their internal peace. You remember what I was talking about, being in your head, or being present. Well, imagine waking up and looking on Facebook and seeing another 10,000 people who are ridiculing me, shaming me, or calling me whatever names because my issue was posted on someone's Facebook page with reach, with a voice, and now I'm being shamed for it. And can you imagine that feeling of waking up every morning and hearing more people say all these bad things about you and you believing them? Now, the peace of God that I was talking about, it's only when you have a clear head. If you're stuck in your head, feeling bad for yourself, if you're grieving, if you're anxious, if got regret, you cannot reach that peace of God. And what she did was robbed this young person of that peace, and being afraid of being uh, accosted, uh, being abused. Now, the same kid, what if we put him back into a male locker room? A lot of male locker rooms have bullying, and including sexual abuse. There's been some local issues about that, and hazing. So do you think that he also deserves protection? What she did was remove that protection.
well. So there's a couple of different things I feel like to be said there. So like I don't think I can't speak. I'm not inside the mind of Representative Laurel Libby, so I'm not going to pretend to say what she was thinking. But like from everything that I've heard, the intention there, the point in posting that is not about like trying to shame the child, right? That was not the intention, is my understanding. Okay.
Two pictures and both his names.
Yeah,
She was
yeah,
she,
I
she
understand, but
removed.
it was so here's the thing, because I've had this conversation with, because for the record, there are a lot of people on the right that were upset with her about that, right? Especially within her own party. I spoke with a representative this week who was somebody who was like very in favor of her, and was hoping she might run for governor. Who knows? But prior to that, but afterwards was like, I'm not interested. So there are people on the right that were upset about that too. They're like, I agree on the issue, but I don't like what she did. Right? They don't like how she did it. And one of the things that I sit here and I look at, and I again, like, I've not talked to, I can't think of a situation where I was talking to a Republican who agrees, for instance, that she should have posted that. But that feels like that we want that child to be shamed. Like, we are concerned for that child, is the reality. Like, I don't like, I feel bad for the kid, very much so. However, there is the reality that there's this problem. There's this problem in our society. And I think it's a twofold problem. And you and I are probably going to disagree about this, and that's fine. But I think it's a twofold problem. One is this gender ideology in general, I think, is not healthy. I think historically this has been known as a mental illness. And I don't think it's healthy to encourage people into a mental illness. Like, and that's what I believe it is. And you and I definitely, I know from the conversation so far, we don't agree about that, right? But that's how I see that it is. So I don't think it's healthy to encourage that, number one. And so when I look at this situation and what's led to this child being in this situation where he has obviously, everybody knows his stuff, and like, yeah, he probably did receive bullying, and I don't think that's good, and I'm not in favor of that. But how do we have this conversation? So, and I think that one of the things that happened as a result of this is it sparked a conversation that we really needed to have. And here's the question: like, had she just wrote a post, I don't think it does that. Had she just posted it and blurred out his face, or I don't think it does that, right? And so I think that, like, it's one of those things where I look at it and I'm like, I don't love it, right? I don't love that there's a child that's in the middle of this, but this is a conversation we needed to have. And this started the conversation. And would it have been able to happen without that? And I don't know that it would. And so when I look at what that kid's going through, who do I blame? I blame the education system. I think, parents for not protecting that child from being in that situation, because whether it was her or somebody else, this was going to happen, right? Because this is where we are. And so, this is the divide that we have in our society, and there's a good portion of us who are not happy about this and are very concerned about it. Now, again, I'm not telling you what you need to do with your kids, that for the record, but I think that, but yeah, anyway, I'll let you respond to that.
So she was censured on the floor and said to bring the post down and apologize, not to us, not to the House, not to the chair, but to the child. And she refused to. So it was completely up to her to get her speaking and voting rights back. And by the way, that didn't apply to her committee, which is the Labor Committee, which I was on with her. She showed up 4 or 5 times the entire session. So she had the right to vote. She didn't. She had the right to speak. She didn't, except for a few times for a few issues like paid family medical leave or child labor laws. I think she might have shown up for that one. So she had the opportunity, but she didn't. All she had to do was take it down and apologize. Instead, she dug her heels in and said, "I'm not going to." And
so it's interesting though, like but that is exactly what you're talking about. That is free speech, right?
well,
They're trying to compel her to not say this. You can't say this if you want to be a representative, and you have to say this. And look, again, I'm not inside her mind. I don't know what she would have done if they just said, "No, you don't have to take it down, but you have to apologize." I don't know. Maybe she keeps it up, and maybe she apologizes to him. But like telling her that she has to take it down again, that is actually a violation, in my opinion. That's a violation of free speech, because she is making a post is a form of speech. And so saying that in order to be a representative, you are limited in what you're able to say in the public square. That is exactly what that is, and that is 100% a violation of free speech. And the penalty means that her constituents don't have somebody who has the capacity to vote in Augusta on their behalf. That means they basically don't have representation unless she gives away her ability to speak freely. Like that seems like it's a violation, which I think is why the Supreme Court struck it, right? And yes, she did still have the ability to be in the committee, but we both know that like what happens in the committee helps laws progress to get finished. But what the votes that really matter are the ones that happen on the floor, because especially this session, there were a lot of situations where, and I'm not an expert in this, I'm still new to this, but there are a lot of situations in which the minority report, so not even the one that was presented, that was passed in the committee, it was actually the minority one, which was the one that was presented on the floor. So what happens on the floor, which is where she couldn't vote, is actually the most important place for her voters, because that's where the bill actually becomes the law, right? I'm not saying the committee doesn't matter, don't get me wrong, it does, and fortunately that hadn't been taken away, but like that is free. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, do you understand? Like,
but her right to speak she still had it. She could go on Fox News and talk all day long, and nobody arrested her. Nobody,
sure. Like her constitutional right still existed, but in order to have her job, essentially, she was required to change her speech, which I think still counts as a violation of free speech according to the U.S. I say still. I'm very confident that is still especially coming from the government, saying in order to have your government position, you have to limit what you say. The Constitution talked about when they were overturning the previous versions of Title IX, which is what led to this whole situation, right? The Biden Title IX revisions included a lot of the protections for transgender stuff, right? And they were removed. Why were they removed? Why did the federal court strike them down? Well, the two things were cited. More than this, it's more complicated. Go read it. I encourage you, anybody. But is chilled speech and compelled speech. that was the issue, right? Is that it was basically forcing people to say things that they didn't believe, and it was discouraging them from being able to say things that they did believe, right? And so it was a violation of free speech. So that's what this is.
But isn't the same thing happening on college campuses where people are talking about the genocide in Gaza, where they're not allowed to speak, or else they're called anti-Semitic, or they're being, terrorist sympathizers, all because they want a genocide to stop. People have been rounded up from colleges. There's one person that was rounded up. He was released, but he was rounded up because of what he wrote or what they wrote.
Look, I am a free speech absolutist. This is where I think I differ to a degree. Absolutist goes a little bit far because I don't think
yell in a crowded theater,
Yeah, I do think that when I say absolutist, I don't think that you should be walking around handing out pornography to children, right? That's technically a form of speech that I don't think. But I think that if somebody is here in this country legally, and we could play around with that topic too. But if somebody is in this country legally, right? I think whether they're on a green card or they're on a work visa or a student visa, I think that the Constitution, I believe, guarantees them free speech. And so if somebody is deported, if I've heard stories, I haven't delved into them. I'm not okay with that, right? What they were doing, even if I disagree with them, right? Like I don't, like the Israel issue is very complex, and I've largely I actually did a podcast on it without really going in one direction or the other. I think it's a very complicated issue, and I think people who think that they have a simple, easy answer for the Middle East probably need to check and see if they have any brain cells left, because that situation has been what it is for a long time, and I don't see it calming down anytime soon. It's kind of like, it reminds me of the Capulets versus the Montagues, right? And I think I'd love it if those two would make peace, but I just don't see it happening, and so that between the Arabs and the Israelites. And so neither side is going to back down. And anyway, so I don't love a lot of aspects of what's going on in that situation, but I try not to get into it. I'm not involved. It's not my thing. My biggest thing is I think the U.S. government probably shouldn't. It's not really our issue, and like I don't know how much money we should be spending on this is a huge question, and that's my biggest concern. But like if somebody thinks that there's a genocide happening in Gaza and they want to say that publicly, I don't think they should not be allowed to do that. Now, what I wonder, because I think unfortunately when things are in the media the way that the world exists right now, I feel like half the time I'm like, I need more detail. And half the problem is a lot of the news sources, they don't share the data. They kind of share their twist, their interpretation of what happened. They don't share, this person did this and said that. And so was this guy that was detained, was there more to the story? Was he doing more than just speaking, or was he actually intimidating people? I don't know. Like I'm not there. I haven't looked into it, but if there's, but the bottom line is if somebody is, arrested or detained or anything like that unconstitutionally, I'm against it. Right. Mm-hmm. Even if I disagree with their views.
Without due process, without, a speech trial, right to a lawyer, right to remain silent, all those things that protect us citizens and really do protect us.
Absolutely.
But, being in the government for the short time that I have been, I've seen this selective enforcement. There's a selective enforcement of laws out there, and some people it applies to, and some people it doesn't. Some people who can afford the lawyers or can afford, the bail, they're free. When I watched the Republican Party in the state of Maine circle the wagons around one of their own members who strangled their wife a week before the election for 20 seconds, strangled his wife. And they didn't ask for him to step down. He was on the lam for a weekend before he turned himself in.
This is news to me. I've not heard about this.
Look him up. Lucas Lanigan. He's one of the representatives. He strangled his wife until she urinated in public because he got caught with another woman. And they circled the wagons around him. They circled the wagons around one of their own representatives who was forging signatures for the clean election campaign. He's still in office.
Allegedly. I mean, if
But
I think that
Democrats a few years back all stepped down. A Democrat stepped down because allegedly was, forging signatures and stuff. So here's 3 of their representatives who they claim law and order unless they lose more of their numbers, and that's what happened. I lost a lot of respect for that whole party.
I'll have to do some digging on that. I have done a little bit on the person who had forged signatures, and I think the belief that's being presented is that it's a. I think if they had proof that they were forged, I'd be surprised how he would not just have been removed by now. And so I'm skeptical that they were really forged. I think that's. But by the way, if he did forge them, he should not be in office. He should be kicked out. Like, this is the reality. This is where I stand. I don't like the reality is like essentially part of what you're saying here is that we have gangs, and there's the Democrat gang and there's a Republican gang. And is that true? Yeah, I think that's true. I think there is a degree of that, that like the Democrats will support one another, the Republicans will support one another. By and large, they kind of can in some ways act like gangs. Again, without looking into the details of any of these things that you've just mentioned, which I'm loosely aware of the signatures, and I had asked some people about it, and what I basically got is that they didn't believe that it was legitimately forged. But time will tell. I don't think, by the way, I don't know that this is what you're saying, but I think that you could look at this instance versus the one where there was a Democrat that was accused or whatever of forging signatures, and you could say, well, this guy resigned, and so that's a better response than the person who's fighting it. And it's like, well, it could also be that one guy's fighting it because it's illegitimate, and the other guy resigned because he knew it was true. Like, again, I don't know. I've not looked into the data on either one of those, but I think looking at that, we without knowing more information, I think that it's a more complex story than simply our side did what was right, your side did what was wrong. But again, I don't like. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's good to have gang mentality as the short version, and I don't operate that way. So anyway.
Yeah, I don't really see it as a gang mentality. We have a caucus, and I can say that I've forged relationships with many in my caucus, but there are some corporate Dems, to be unidentified. They exist in their world, and I exist in my world, and I have they're not cliques or anything, but they're people that I can talk to, and who can agree with many of the things that Dems advocate for, which is housing for everyone, healthcare for everyone, fair wages for everyone, just care. Well, on the other side, I don't know the makeup of how they do their politics. I know who their leaders are. I know who their new representatives are, but I don't know who the real leaders are. And there are many leaders on both sides, both parties, and some of them can make their way and get things done, and other ones are left left with their hands in the air, trying to figure out what happened to a bill because it was allowed to die, and it was from the Democrat side. We have the majority. We have the trifecta, where we've got the House, the Senate, and the governorship, yet we still cannot pass a lot of progressive ideals. So when you look at the Democrat Party, who can't make things happen, even though they've got the trifecta there, you have to wonder who's really in charge. Okay. And so this is not an indictment of our majority leadership. I have much respect for our leaders, our chair. I have much respect for the minority leaders. I try to, but there was another instance where, as a new legislator, I try to give as much attention and respect to everybody who's speaking on the House floor, and I turn my chair and I listen to them. I look at them and I watch them. I see a lot of legislators on their phones, on their computers, answering emails while people are giving speeches. And I find that disrespectful on both sides of the aisle. So I try to give as much as attention that I can to legislators when they're speaking. And oftentimes I don't agree with them, but sometimes you can. One of the things that a committee, being on a committee, does is allow you to sit by legislators who don't agree with you. So there is a mix of Republicans and Democrats on committees. And one of the legislators, she decided to sit out a prayer that was being given by a trans woman pastor, and the words that came out of their mouth was a Christian prayer. It was compassion, it was empathy, but they decided to boycott this person saying a prayer. They politicized a prayer because it was a trans person.
Well,
So I asked about them. I asked them, I said, would Jesus do that? And they lost their shit.
Well,
They
I don't know what they said or how they said it, but I would not engage in prayer with somebody who I believed was actively living out a rebellion against what I believe is God's law and the way that God ordained things to be. I would not engage in that prayer myself. I think that there are certain things that are, clear in Scripture to me, and I know that there are different views and understandings of Scripture. Some people don't take the Bible literally and believe that it is literally the word of God. They think it's kind of like a good playbook and there are some things that can be adjusted. That's not the view I take. And in the view I take, there is a strong danger. One of the things that Scripture actually tells is basically how you interact with somebody who calls themselves a Christian and is, as we would call it, living in a certain type of sin, versus how you interact with somebody who is an unbeliever is different, right? And if somebody is calling themselves a Christian and doing something that is part of the Christian faith, that basically you're not to take part. This is actually a biblical command. You're not to take part together with that person. You wouldn't pray with somebody who's not a believer either, but like you can engage with people. There is basically this place where if somebody has like what we would believe has abandoned core elements of the truth, we would not engage, in religious ceremonies with them. That's not politics, by the way. That's religion. So I know that but like that is religion.
says
Yeah.
there is no religious test for public office, and so
Well,
you have
but you don't have to participate in that if it happens there. It's if that's who the leaders in the House want to do the opening prayer, that's that's what the leadership can do. But like saying that somebody has to participate in that religious thing, I think is not is not a good thing. I guess is not in line with
there's
comments on religious liberty.
Yeah, there's a rotation of people who come in and they represent churches from all over the state, and I stand politely and listen to their prayer and listen and say the Pledge of Allegiance immediately after that, and I do that, and I don't like play my
I probably wouldn't leave myself. I would probably listen, but I would not be like praying with them is kind of the way that I would say. I don't feel like I would need to, but I can understand where somebody's coming from, because this is like spiritual things are very like, I think there's a personal element, but there's also like a discomfort. And like, I think if somebody's just uncomfortable with something, like them stepping out and saying, I can't participate in this is not a bad thing. If it happened on the other direction, I think we would have some different views, but anyway, yeah. It's interesting.
It is, and I really would like to talk a little bit more about the spiritual aspect of what constituents expect from their legislators, and if those legislators claim Christianity as their reason for going into office and being pro-life and parental rights and all those type of things, that they should vote in ways that show their Christianity. And it's not just for unborn babies, but for born babies. Imagine if a young woman who found herself pregnant without any money, without somebody to help her, knew that she was going to be cared for, and that her child was not going to go hungry, and that they were going to be able to afford diapers. But instead, they decide to not have that child because they don't have a job, they can't afford a home, they can't afford, all those reasons why they convince themselves why they shouldn't have a child. Why can't we as a government make sure that if we are pro-life, that we are taking care of those children that are being born in poverty?
Yeah, I think
Where
the answer that I would have is that that's not the role of government, right? I think that's the role of we used to have like years, for a long time historically, we had orphanages, which we decided was bad. I don't think that the current system is working much better than the orphanage system. But there was a time where orphanages were not funded by the governments. You know what I mean?
and they were
And
religious in nature, and it was our Native Americans here went to orphanages and went to Christian schools, and their language was beaten out of them, their culture was beaten out of them, so allowing a any religion to be responsible for that. I've seen what country where
well,
that happened.
no, people weren't
That was
forced into those. Like
where the
it was.
Taliban were in charge, and they were a religious, a theocracy. Uh, they they ruled based on their religion, and all the women had to be covered, and the women couldn't go to school. They weren't allowed to go to school. I saw what happens in a country like that. So if we
Yeah,
allow our religions to be responsible for the health care of people, or for the caregiving of our children, we're going down the wrong course.
yeah, I think I would disagree for a couple of reasons, but this is one where I'm like, I want to go gather some data to have a more robust conversation, but I don't have the time to kind of pull that all up right now. But I believe, based on other things that I've seen, that you actually have better outcomes in those types of situations when there is a spiritual element involved. Like I think that there are bad things that can sometimes happen, and there are problems associated with that. But I think the problem of the government being in charge of healthcare, I think the government being in charge of what happens to children who are in poverty, is not, it's not working. Like, here's the thing: is like the more we've given over to government, the worse things keep getting. Like, and there are other factors that are leading to that as well. But I think the government is not the answer. That's the biggest problem. Is like I want to make sure people are taken care of better, but I actually don't think the government is. And I think whether you agree with like Christianity or other religions, I think like people in religious organizations doing these types of things actually, I think I'm not going to speak to Islam because it's a very different religion, and the Taliban is also like not, I think, a normal organization even within the Islamic religion. So I think they're very much not normative, right? And I think like when you look at what generally happens in religiously run orphanages, I think you have a lot better outcomes, far better outcomes than what you have currently in DHHS, where former current Democrat but former Senator Bill Diamond is going around talking about how many children have died in DHHS care, and I have people in my family who are dealing with the current insanity of the DHHS system, and the problems that are happening there. Like, while like religious organizations may not be perfect and there are problems that happen within them, and we like I think it'd be far better than that. And I also, like you kind of had suggested, we shouldn't allow churches. Like I think we should allow people. Don't have to, nobody's forced to go into these situations. If somebody's in need and somebody's willing to help them, they make a decision, right? But I think that in general, this is not a government. I don't think the government is the answer. I think if there's one thing I could get across in my opinion is that I don't think the government is the answer. I think getting the government out of the way creates opportunity. But one of the things I often say, I'm thinking about education, and we could get into that at some other point. I think we're coming up on 2 hours at this point, so we should probably wrap it up relatively soon. I'm sure you got other things to get to, but what I would get across is I just don't think the government is the answer. We need the government to get out of the way, but this is where I was trying to go and I distracted myself. It is that when you get into like education, for instance, you've got the people on the right who are basically like, we need to get woke out of schools and then that will fix schools and get back to teaching the basics. And I think that there's a reality to that. I think that there is an element of truth there, but I think that there's also a lack of understanding of what's actually happening in schools outside of, what we've talked about earlier in where you and I probably disagree is on the transgender ideology and just teaching all the gender stuff that's going on in schools. That I don't think that has a place there. I don't think that's the education's role. But that aside, I don't think, even though I believe that, I don't think removing that and focusing just on teaching is going to solve the entire problem. I think it's progress. It's not progressive, but I think it's progress. But I think we have a lot more challenges as a society. And there are a lot of things that we need to figure it out. And even if we get the government out of the way, and because I think that they're not helping, they're hurting, we need to come up with what's our plan as a society, not as a government, mind you, right? As a people, like how do we more effectively address those issues? And maybe how we get the government out of the way is we start addressing those issues better. But I fear that with the government in the way, that people are so clinging to seeing the government as the answer that they will not be able to they see other potential opportunities. But yeah, I think that the short version is, I think culturally, we as a society need to change the way in which we do things. And that's a big part of the problem, but we also need to get the government out of the way. That's my perspective. I'll give you an opportunity to respond.
Yeah, you brought up the term woke, and that term goes back, several decades, African American vernacular English, where it was basically people who are aware of the injustices that have been experienced by the Black population in America, whether it's being pulled over while driving black, or not being hired for a whole host of reasons, but using education or other reasons to not, there's a lot of reasons why we could, as Americans, decide to ally with those people who have seen injustice in their lives. And if you have empathy, I think I would say that I woke up when I had that moment of clarity, that I understood what God was and who God was. And I woke up when I had the realization that there are people out there who are doing a lot without, and I wanted to help. So I would say that I am woke, but I'm not spouting any, radical leftist ideology when I say I want everybody to be happy, healthy, and housed. That's not radical to me. That's just a part of supposedly living in the greatest nation in the world. But so many of us live in poverty. So many of us can't even afford heating oil. So many of us are in debt because we got cancer. So many of us. Do we really live in the greatest nation in the world if so many people are left out of the greatness?
Given the fact that people are, going through some very challenging things just to be able to get here, to be one of the poor people here, I would say that yes, I think we probably do. But are there challenges? I mean, the world, we're never going to be unicorns and rainbows and everybody's perfectly happy and has everything that they need. But also, I think there is an element that I think is missing in this, is because I worked in banking, right? I worked with a lot of people across the state of Maine, people who are the poorest people I've ever met to some of the richest people that I've ever met. Although the richest person I ever met was probably Sean Conlon. He was got a show on CNBC, The Deal Chicago. I was flying back from getting married, and I was flying in first class, which is a rare thing that I've ever done. But for going over for my wedding, my friend who's a travel agent convinced me to do it. So for flying back, I had Sean Conlon next to me. Didn't know who he was, and we just had a conversation. And anyway, it was really kind of fun. But anyway, I've seen people from the poorest to people who are worth $500 million, right? I think that one of the there are a lot of good people out there that work really hard, do the best that they can, and struggle, right? That does exist, but by and large, a lot of the differences between people who are struggling and people who are not, in my experience, from all the people that I worked with, it's poor decisions is one of the major factors in people being in really uncomfortable situations. And you kind of highlighted some of this, and some of it is people are making poor decisions about what they think they need. And so one of the things that I saw so often is that people would go out to buy a car, for instance, and they would decide that they needed to buy a new car. And they would go and they had a budget. And this is the maximum that we could pay. And then they would get there, and then the salesman would get crafty and try to get them to buy a more expensive vehicle. And they would say to themselves, if we cut out Netflix, if we get rid of this and we get rid of this and we get rid of this and we get rid of this, we can make it, right? We can get this car, this really exciting car. And then they go home and they don't cancel any of those things. So then they come to me, or they used to come to me, and now they're in credit card debt. And how do we help get them out? And we have to refinance their mortgage or whatever. Or do a debt consolidation loan or whatever the solution would end up being. But how you got there was when you went to buy a house, you bought a house that was too expensive. When you went to buy a car, you bought a car that was too expensive. A lot of people who are spending money without thinking about, a lot of people are living without a budget. Now, like that's almost everybody out there. So, and like I have people in my family who, I'm not going to out them particularly, but who, like, you talk about like $45,000 a year, never made that much money, but has a family of 6 and are making it, never having made that much money, own a house, multiple vehicles, and they make wise decisions given their budget on what to do. I'm not saying they've never made any mistakes, but I don't subsidize them. I'm not saying I haven't helped them here or there a little bit, but I don't subsidize them. Not that I at this point have the income to subsidize anybody. But like, the point is, like, they're not getting help from people. They're just working hard and trying to be smart about using what they have wisely. And they have a home, they have, 4 kids, and they're doing well. And that's all in one income. Because my sister-in-law is home. I just said it. But the point is, you can get by. And I think that a big part of the problem is people are not making wise decisions. So that's it. I don't think that's the whole problem, right? I think there's other challenges that we need to deal with, major corporations, and we need to more innovation and more business opportunity for small businesses and stuff like that. But anyway.
There's a lot of people living on the edge of poverty. They're making enough to pay their bills, or making enough to pay those high interest rate credit cards. They're making enough to pay for their cars, but they're house poor, or they can't afford vacations, or if they do lose their job, they're just a couple paychecks away from homelessness, or if they there's a lot of reasons why people find themselves in dire straits. And if the government is not there to provide some sort of safety net that allows, families like you said you were on food stamps when you were a child, and
yep.
it made sure that there was food in your home, or there was heating oil so you had heat or air conditioning during the summer. All those programs that are provided for by the government are helping people. They actually do help people from these dire straits. So although government is not the answer for everything, there are safety nets that the government does provide that make sure that people aren't falling through the cracks. And to wanting to support that and fund those socialism type programs, if that's woke, then I'm woke. I want to make sure that if somebody does find themselves without a job, let's say they get laid off, no fault of their own, and now they can't find a job for the next 3 months, and now they have no steady income, they're going to need some help.
And what we would say in banking is, this is what we would advise, is that you should always have 3 to 6 months worth of money set aside in emergency savings, and nobody does it, right?
It actually has that, yeah.
Well, it's a small percentage of the population, like probably less than 40%. But the reason for that, and again, this is from my experience in banking, and this is from looking at people's statements and looking at where they're spending their money, is it's not that there's not opportunity for them to trim stuff and save money and live more wisely. It's that they're making poor decisions. And like, they're free to make those poor decisions, but not to have me bail them out or us bail them out because they're making poor decisions. This is the problem, is the biggest problem that I have. I'm not wholly against any type of programs to help people in dire straits. But I think that we've gotten to the point where people live off of that's a constant part of their income. And like, I think that this is where this is part of where the problem lies, because like, again, the government in administering that problem cost a lot more money than it actually costs to give people help in those situations, because they have to have all these staff, they have to have all these programs, and they, I think they, first of all, they give out way more than is necessary, and these become long-term plans for people's lives, not short-term, and basically cause people to be stuck on the system. So like, should we have systems in our society where we help people who are going through dire straits? Are there, extenuating circumstances where people were making all the right decisions and they had money set aside, but something happened and now they can't work, and now whatever it is, they don't have any income, they spent all the money, and now what do they do? How are they going to survive? Should we as a society have a way to help them? I think, number one, I would say yes, we as a society should. But when I say we as a society, I think it's very different than we as a government. And I'm not in favor. I think what we've seen out of these programs is they just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger and taking up more, and the free market struggles, and businesses, like lots of businesses, we've seen it in Portland, a ton of businesses are going out of business. You talked about minimum wage earlier. That's another one that I think impacts that, specifically with the restaurants in Portland. A lot of these restaurants ended up going out of business. Some of people's fan favorites, because they couldn't keep staff, couldn't afford the higher prices that kept coming up. And so like, I think, like, I want the same thing, in the sense that I want there to be something to help people who, when they're really in dire straits, but I also want it to not be a lot harder for it to be manipulated. And I don't want people to live on it. I want a society where people have jobs. And I think the bigger the government gets, the more, because the government is a leech, right? The government doesn't produce anything. It doesn't create it doesn't like have products that it creates. It basically takes from what's existing and takes a portion and then uses that to live off of, but it doesn't create opportunity outside of people who get directly paid. But that's still not the same thing. It's those services would have to be provided, and they would be paid by the free market, and so it basically is a leech that lives off of everything, and the bigger it gets, the harder it is for the thing that it's living off of to survive. And that's the danger. And I think that's, like, again, having some social safety net, whether that's government or church or other different things, I don't think I have a problem with. I don't like the government angle, because like I said, I don't think they do a great job. But I think we need to care about our fellow person and try to help people. But I think that the way in which we're doing it, I think, is just unhelpful. Ultimately, big picture, it helps individual people in some ways, and some people that I think are legitimate. But I think there's a lot more abuse, and there are a lot more people that are stuck on it as a result of it, and can never get off, and don't have the motivation to get off, because why would they? So anyway, fun stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there's no easy answer for a lot of this. But although one thing I do see is we spend $1 trillion. The federal government spends $1 trillion on our defense, our national defense, and just imagine if just a fraction of that was used to pay for healthcare, like they do for our warriors, our soldiers, sailors, and airmen. They get free healthcare.
Well, the challenge there, I think, well, they don't get, it's not free. They have to put their lives on the line, but but they get healthcare paid by the government. However, like we're at a national deficit of like $2 trillion a year. So even if we're trimming the federal government, we're still going into debt further and further and further. And eventually that bill is going to come due, and it's going to be really bad. It's probably going to lead to World War III, like all this other stuff, because like when we can't pay our bills because we've overspent, like as a government, making the same mistake that individuals are making, I think that's dangerous. So I'm not opposed to doing. I think that there's a lot of opportunity for cutting in the federal budget related to defense. I don't think we need to cut it to the bone. I do think that there's a lot of dangerous countries out there that would like to eliminate us, and I think we need to remain a powerful nation militarily, but that doesn't mean that there's no room for cuts. And I think there absolutely are. I have family members that have been in the military, and they're like, oh yeah, there is room for opportunity. You've been there, so there's plenty of room to make cuts there. I just don't. I think that we've got other problems there, Anyway, but yeah, so we're not going to agree, but like, I think what if people are watching, they've seen is you got two different angles, like both sides who want to help people and provide opportunities for people who are in challenging situations, but have a different philosophy on how we make a better society.
Yeah, and uphold the Constitution. That's
Yep.
I've taken that oath many times in my
Yep.
lifetime, and
Well, thank you for your service as well, by the way. I didn't mention that earlier, but
so I don't consider myself a radical. I do consider myself a progressive. Progress is good. I do believe progress is good, and as a society that cares for everyone, a society that cares for everyone, I think would be a good place to live. And for to have, as an American citizen, have that peace of mind knowing that you have the opportunity to go be a business, go be a billionaire, but at the same time, you are not going to go hungry or go homeless because of the greed of a small percentage of us who just aren't willing to. And frankly, our government is watering the bloom. We help out those that don't need the help. Those big corporations with their subsidies and their tax cuts and tax breaks and all that. And so we're helping those that don't really need the help, but we're pointing at the poorest of the poor who are getting a fraction of what people earn working, and they're being the ones blamed for all our societal woes. And I just disagree with that.
yeah, I don't. It's an interesting point. I don't know that I think that we're blaming poor people for our problems, but I think criminals. We're paying criminals for problems, and
we're blaming immigrants.
There is a problem there, and I was having this conversation earlier today. I think that I blame the federal government for not doing its job and allowing a bunch of people to illegally enter the country. Right. But you're right. There are a lot of people that blame the immigrants for our problems, whereas I think that if you're somebody who's living in dire straits and you're living in a really bad situation in another country and you have no hope, and you find out, partly because our federal government was literally had people in other countries telling people that if you come here, you'll be taken care of. This is the path to go. I don't blame them so much. They're in a crappy situation. America is still the greatest nation in the world, I believe, to live in. And so I don't have it's hard for me to be like, oh my gosh, you thought you had no hope, and then you found out there might be some hope and you decided to take it. I don't have a problem with that. I'm not saying that means that they should stay if they've come here illegally, but I do understand where they're coming from, and I'm not upset with them. Who I'm upset with is the federal government, who allowed it to happen and actually encouraged it to happen. That's who we conservatives, if you're listening, that's who you should be upset with. You should not be upset with these people. In my opinion, they're being used by we saw this in Portland last year leading up to the election. I had a friend call me and be like, what in the world is going on? There are 25 children sleeping outside behind the Boys and Girls Club of America in Portland. And the state of Maine knew about it, and they weren't doing anything about it because they didn't have any space, but they'd encouraged people to come. Like, Maine has made it very obvious that we want people to get here. And so these Angolans had made their way here, and there they were in October. It's not warm in October, in makeshift tents, which is just really like sheets and blankets, living outside. And there were like 25 children, and there were also some adults, including with the children. There were like 2 children that were 2 weeks old. And it's like I don't blame them for coming here. Again, I blame the federal government, and I think and different governments. I think Maine, knowing that it can make money from federal stuff for taking care of people in these situations, and that it can bring revenues from the federal government into the state of Maine, and a plethora of other things, maybe some voters down the road, is definitely, I think, part of the idea. At least that's what we think on this side. But I don't blame immigrants. I don't think they're the reason. I think that there are some bad players, and I think one of the things that I will say is that one of the reasons that we don't let people come in without vetting them in the first place is because then you then criminals come through. And I think that part of the reason there's a lot of overreaction against immigrants in general is because among a lot of the people who came here illegally, there were a lot of criminals that came in and who've done some pretty awful things. And okay, I'm upset with people who commit crime, who murder people, who rape people and stuff like that. And so I have a problem with those immigrants. But if they were native born and they're doing that, I have a problem with them as well. So I have a problem with people who do really violent things and bad things regardless of where they come from. But I think that's created this environment where I think the government has gotten us to look at each other rather than looking at them as being the culprit, right? And that's my opinion there. So
we have more of a class war than a left and right war. It's a top and bottom. Yeah. It's a class differences, and the rich are doing just fine, and they're tempting us to just blame each other, and this is where we're at right now.
Yeah. I think Russell Brand is a guy I really like to listen to, and I remember him saying at one point is we don't have a battle of the left versus the right, although I myself continue to use that language. I think there are elements where we do have some challenges there, but it's really more, as he says, it's the middle versus the extremes, I think is what he was saying. Anyway, I lost it, but not the left versus right, but it's the middle against the extremes. And so, I think the wealthy people, I'm usually talking about the global elites, and I think they're the people who are driving things. I think that's less, your neighbors who vote Democrat or Republican, and it's more this group of people who are trying to influence policy in a way that benefits them. And I think right now, I definitely think that they have some tentacles on the right, but it seems to me that their ideologies are have a stranglehold on the Democrats at this point. That's where I come from. But that's what I see.
And I'm not, owned by anybody. I'm going up there as your average citizen, just a retiree who has the time and can accept a low-paying position as a legislator, and be able to try to, do things to uphold the Constitution and protect the my constituents, and the people of the state of Maine.
Yeah. Well, though we don't agree on everything, I appreciate you taking the time to come on and serving our nation, and then trying to and serving our state to the best of your knowledge, ability, belief, worldview. That's the best we can ask of anyone, even if we don't agree. So, like I said, thanks for taking the time, and thank you all for watching. And we'll be back here. I found myself in a busy week of podcasting after doing very few for a couple of weeks. I think I've got 5 this week, so this is one of 5. So if you like it, keep watching. So thanks again, Rafael, and hang out for just a second. We'll end the show and then maybe keep chatting briefly. But yeah, thank you all for watching, and we'll see us here tomorrow, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, at 1 p.m. with Representative David Boyer. So see you all then. Thanks.